Imagine a government creates an investment fund with billions of dollars, promising that the money will help develop an entire country. Now imagine that more than $4.5 billion disappears, not in one transaction, not into one bank account, but through a maze of companies, offshore accounts, financial institutions, luxury properties, artwork, a super yacht, and even Hollywood. This is the story of 1MDB, one of the largest financial scandals in modern history. And this is the money trail. In 2009, the Malaysian government created an investment fund called One Malaysia Development Berhad, better known as 1MDB. The idea was relatively simple. Malaysia wanted to attract investment, develop major projects, and strengthen the country's economy. 1MDB was supposed to raise money through investments and bonds, then use that capital for economic development. Instead, according to U.S. investigators and court documents, billions of dollars were diverted from the fund between 2009 and 2015. The U.S. Department of Justice has alleged that more than $4.5 billion belonging to 1MDB was misappropriated during that period. And the really fascinating part isn't just the amount of money. It's what happened after the money left the fund. Because it didn't simply disappear, it moved, and investigators eventually began following the trail. One of the central figures was a Malaysian financier named Low Tech Joe, better known as Joe Low. Low wasn't officially the head of 1MDB, but according to U.S. prosecutors, he played a central role in moving and using money connected to the fund. The scheme allegedly relied on a complicated network of companies and bank accounts across multiple countries. And this is where things get complicated. Imagine you have $1 billion. If you transfer that $1 billion directly into someone's personal account, it's relatively easy to understand what happened. But what if the money moves from one company to another, then another company in a different country, and then into an account belonging to an offshore entity? The money can start to look like an ordinary business transaction. That's essentially what investigators alleged happened with portions of the 1MDB money. The funds were allegedly moved through shell companies and financial institutions in countries including Malaysia, Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, and the United States. In one case described by the U.S. Department of Justice, approximately $850 million connected to a 2014 transaction was allegedly diverted into offshore shell entities. The important thing about a shell company is that the company itself doesn't necessarily have to be illegal. A company can be completely legitimate. The problem is that layers of companies can make it much harder to determine who ultimately controls the money. And that is exactly what made the 1MDB story so difficult to unravel. The money wasn't sitting in one giant account waiting to be discovered. It was moving through a network. But eventually, some of that money began appearing in places that were very difficult to explain as ordinary government investments. Luxury real estate, expensive artwork, jewelry, a massive yacht, and even Hollywood. According to the Justice Department, funds connected to the scheme were used to acquire properties in places including New York, Beverly Hills, and London. Millions of dollars were also spent on artwork. That included works associated with artists such as Vincent van Gogh, Claude Monet, and Andy Warhol. And then there was the yacht, a 300-foot super yacht reportedly purchased with money linked to the scheme. The name of the yacht was Equanimity. But perhaps one of the strangest destinations for the money was Hollywood. According to U.S. prosecutors, money connected to the 1MDB scheme was used to help finance films through Red Granite Pictures. One of those films was The Wolf of Wall Street. That doesn't mean the film itself was secretly part of a criminal conspiracy. The allegation was that misappropriated money was used to finance the production company behind the movie, and that detail gives you a sense of just how far the money had traveled. What began as money raised by a Malaysian government investment fund could allegedly end up financing luxury lifestyles, real estate, artwork, and Hollywood productions thousands of miles away. But there was another major piece of the puzzle: the banks. In 2012 and 2013, 1MDB raised billions through bond transactions. Goldman Sachs was involved in arranging 3 of those deals. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, former Goldman Sachs banker Roger Ng conspired with others to launder billions of dollars connected to 1MDB and to pay more than $1 billion in bribes to officials in Malaysia and Abu Dhabi. In 2022, a federal jury convicted Ng of participating in the bribery and money laundering scheme. The Justice Department said that more than $2.7 billion was misappropriated in the portion of the scheme involving Ng and his co-conspirators. Goldman Sachs itself was not convicted of the criminal conduct attributed to Ng and others, but the bank eventually reached a multi-billion-dollar settlement with Malaysian authorities over its role in the scandal. And that brings us to one of the most important lessons from the entire case. Moving money at this scale doesn't necessarily require someone to physically steal a suitcase full of cash. It can happen through financial infrastructure: bonds, companies, bank accounts, investment vehicles, wire transfers, real estate, and layers of transactions that individually can look legitimate. The challenge for investigators is figuring out what those transactions actually represent when you connect them together. And eventually, investigators did begin connecting those dots. The United States launched one of the largest asset recovery efforts in its history under its Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. The Justice Department filed dozens of civil forfeiture actions seeking assets allegedly purchased with money connected to 1MDB. By 2024, the department said it had seized more than $1.7 billion in assets and had returned approximately $1.4 billion to Malaysia. And the recovery effort didn't stop there. In January 2025, the Justice Department announced another agreement involving approximately $20 million in additional assets. And in May 2026, the department announced that a New York luxury apartment and associated rental income worth more than $6 million were being forfeited in another case connected to the 1MDB scheme. That means that more than a decade after some of the original transactions took place, investigators are still recovering assets connected to the scandal. But perhaps the biggest question is this: how does billions of dollars move without everyone immediately noticing? The answer is that enormous financial schemes don't necessarily look enormous while they're happening. A single transaction might look like an investment. Another might look like a loan. Another might appear to be a payment to a company. Another might involve a legitimate bank. Another might involve a piece of real estate. It's only when you put all of those transactions together that the larger picture begins to emerge. And that's what makes following the money so powerful. Because money leaves evidence: bank records, company registrations, property purchases, wire transfers, emails, contracts, court documents, and sometimes the people involved leave behind an even more obvious trail. A lifestyle that doesn't match the money they legitimately earned. In the 1MDB case, investigators eventually found a trail that crossed continents and industries, from a Malaysian development fund, to international banks, to offshore companies, to luxury real estate, to priceless artwork, to a superyacht, and even to Hollywood. The US government has described the case as involving more than $4.5 billion in allegedly misappropriated 1MDB funds. And the recovery process continues. The story of 1MDB is a reminder that financial crime doesn't always look like a crime. Sometimes it looks like an investment. Sometimes it looks like a company. Sometimes it looks like a bank transaction. And sometimes it looks like a billion-dollar business deal, until someone follows the trail. And that's where the real story begins. This is the money trail.